The morning of the joint American-European air demonstration began with a haze hanging over the airfield, the sort of thin, pale mist that blurs the world into old film grain and makes everything look like a photograph developed decades ago. Technicians moved between aircraft with practiced rhythm, their boots echoing across the concrete like distant drumbeats. The centerpiece of the day, the one nobody expected to matter, sat alone at the edge of the runway, a restored P-47 Thunderbolt, its silver fuselage muted by the morning fog, its enormous radial engine dark and silent beneath a thick propeller that looked more like an artifact than a functioning component. Pilots from the F-15 squadron walked past it without a second glance. To them, it was little more than a relic, a museum piece dragged out for nostalgia. Lieutenant Aaron Cole, one of the most confident and sharp-tongued pilots in the Eagle program, joked that flying a P-47 was like wrestling a refrigerator through the sky. His wingman laughed and added that one burst of afterburner would blow the dust off its wings and send it spinning into retirement. None of them knew that the pilot chosen to fly the Thunderbolt was not a casual hobbyist or a museum volunteer. He was Captain James Holloway, a man whose quiet demeanor disguised decades of studying the aerial combat tactics of the Second World War. He was a historian in the air as much as a pilot, a man who believed you could not truly understand aviation unless you understood what came before it. He strapped into the Thunderbolt with the familiarity of someone who had lived in its cockpit long before restoration crews brought it back to life. The demonstration that day had been planned as a symbolic intercept exercise. The F-15s would simulate a pursuit scenario. The P-47 would try to evade them using only the tactics available in the 1940s. Cameras would document everything for a historical special about the evolution of air combat. Nobody expected the Thunderbolt to survive more than 20 seconds under pressure. What they forgot was that the P-47 had never been built to be elegant, it had been built to survive. When Holloway taxied the Thunderbolt onto the runway, its engine thundered to life with a deep, rumbling growl that shook the steam rising from the tarmac. Every head on the airfield turned. The sound did not belong to a relic. It belonged to a war machine that had carried men through hell and brought them back home when no other plane could. Cole smirked inside his F-15 cockpit as he watched the P-47 lift off. He had flown against fifth-generation fighters. He had done mock engagements with Eurofighters and F-16s. To him, the Thunderbolt was a harmless challenge, something he would toy with before the real event began. What Cole didn't know was that Holloway had spent months preparing for this demonstration, studying the strengths of the P-47 that modern pilots dismissed. He understood that, while the F-15 had the advantage in speed, climb rate, and avionics, the Thunderbolt had something far more primal on its side: brute force, absurd durability, and the ability to perform extreme maneuvers at low altitudes that modern pilots avoided because they relied on their aircraft's technological superiority rather than gut instinct. The moment the two F-15s launched, cutting twin spears of exhaust through the morning haze, the tone of the event changed. Holloway took the Thunderbolt into a gentle climb, then leveled out and aimed toward the far end of the test range. Cole closed distance quickly, calling over the radio that he would give the old man a chance to warm up before initiating the simulated intercept. Holloway said nothing. He tightened his grip on the controls. The real demonstration was only just beginning. As the Eagles approached, Holloway pushed the Thunderbolt into a shallow dive, gaining speed far faster than most modern pilots realized the aircraft was capable of. The P-47 picked up energy like a falling anvil. Cole prepared to roll into position behind him, confident he could track the Thunderbolt easily with the F-15's radar and helmet-mounted cueing system. Then something unexpected happened. The P-47 dropped lower, far lower, until its wingtips flirted with the tops of trees below the ridge. Holloway flew the Thunderbolt with the recklessness of a man trained to fight in an era when every inch of altitude was either salvation or death. Cole cursed as he lost radar lock when the Thunderbolt dipped below the tracking threshold. The F-15 was not designed to follow a target that low at high speed. His wingmen warned him to climb before they risked an unintended impact with terrain. But Cole refused to lose the old museum piece on the first maneuver. He dove after Holloway. Bad choice. The Thunderbolt leveled out along the tree line, its enormous airframe absorbing small turbulence with barely a shudder. The F-15 shook violently as Cole pushed it into the same path, its wings slicing pockets of rough air that the P-47's massive control surfaces brushed aside like dust. Holloway glanced behind him. The first F-15 was struggling to maintain position. He pulled the Thunderbolt into a climbing turn so sharp the weight of the aircraft should have forced its nose downward, but the P-47 held, digging into the air like a steel fist. Cole tried to follow. He lost energy instantly. The Thunderbolt climbed above him, rolled over the top, and dropped behind him in a maneuver physically impossible for modern aircraft to replicate without advanced thrust vectoring systems. Holloway didn't need vectoring. He needed gravity in the right moment. The test judges in the observation tower leaned forward in shock. Cole, realizing the Thunderbolt now had the angle advantage, snapped into a defensive roll. Holloway tightened the Thunderbolt's turn and held position on Cole's 6 o'clock. For a brief second, every person watching understood why pilots in the Second World War called the P-47 the Juggernaut. Cole climbed to regain his advantage. Holloway followed, not with speed, but with raw determination. The F-15 climbed faster, but Holloway anticipated the maneuver. As Cole went vertical, Holloway cut the Thunderbolt into a half-roll, inverted the aircraft and dove beneath him, disappearing into a valley of low fog. Cole shouted that he had lost visual contact. His wingmen attempted to reacquire the Thunderbolt, but radar readings flickered uselessly. The P-47 was too low, too heavy, too unconventional for the F-15's pursuit algorithms. Holloway reappeared seconds later, blasting out of the fog at an angle that forced Cole into a tight evasive brake. The judges gasped. Cole cursed. Holloway pressed forward. This wasn't a simulation. This was a lesson. The Thunderbolt, built in the 1940s under fire and desperation, was showing modern pilots what it meant to fly without relying on computers, sensors, or digital warnings. Cole recovered and tried to turn the engagement around with a high-speed intercept pattern. Holloway responded with a brutal slashing turn designed for dogfights that ended in seconds rather than minutes. Cole strained against the G-force as he tried to match it. He couldn't. The Thunderbolt came up beside him, not behind, not below, but perfectly level like a steel titan, reminding him of something he had forgotten. Technology means nothing when instinct outmaneuvers it. Cole stared at the massive aircraft for half a second. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. A 70-year-old Wabad was matching an F-15 at angles it had no business flying. Before he could reposition, Holloway dipped the Thunderbolt's wing and dove again. The F-15 followed too late. Holloway cut across the engagement zone, setting up a perfect trailing position behind Cole. The judges declared the engagement over. Holloway had killed the F-15 twice in under 5 minutes. Cole yanked off his helmet and threw it against the console in frustration. Holloway simply taxied the Thunderbolt back toward the ramp, the massive radial engine thundering like a heartbeat carved from steel. The demonstration was supposed to prove the power of modern aircraft. Instead, it proved something else entirely. The P-47 Thunderbolt never died. It simply waited for a chance to remind the world. The airfield was supposed to erupt into applause as the F-15s finished their planned intercept demonstration, but instead the tarmac had fallen into a stunned, suffocating silence. Mechanics, officers, foreign dignitaries, and technicians stood frozen as the P-47 Thunderbolt taxied past them like a bruised heavyweight returning from a fight he had never been expected to survive, let alone dominate. Its propeller slowed with a deep, rumbling heartbeat that echoed across the concrete. Holloway brought the Thunderbolt to a stop, cut the engine, and calmly opened the canopy, not triumphantly, not arrogantly, simply and deliberately, like a man who had done nothing more surprising than warming up an old machine. Meanwhile, Cole descended from his F-15 with the expression of a man who had been punched in the chest by something invisible. His disbelief radiated from him in waves. He tried to mask it with bravado, but even the crew chief saw through it. He had been beaten, not by technology, but by history, and that humiliation weighed heavier than any mechanical defeat. The flight judges reviewed the data silently, their faces pale. They had never seen an older aircraft manipulate energy, terrain, and angles in a way that completely nullified the advantages of a fourth-generation jet. They couldn't explain how the Thunderbolt had maintained enough control authority to pull off half the maneuvers Holloway executed. In the briefing room, officers shuffled papers, rewound footage, and exchanged tense whispers. The footage didn't make sense. The P-47 should have stalled in half those turns. It should have lost energy in the dives. It should have been shredded by low-level turbulence. But the recordings were clear. Holloway flew the jug as if it were an extension of his own spine, a machine fused with instinct and raw physics. Cole stormed into the room, shouting that the Thunderbolt must have been illegally modified, that no piston aircraft could possibly generate that much authority at those angles. His wingman quietly said he didn't think modifications were the explanation. Holloway didn't look shaken, or exhilarated, or even pleased. He simply sat in the corner of the room waiting for the noise to settle. When the senior commander demanded an explanation, Holloway finally spoke. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't defend himself. He simply explained that the Thunderbolt's strengths didn't come from its speed or climb, but from its momentum profile. He said modern pilots had forgotten how dangerous a heavyweight aircraft could be when flown by someone who knew how to use gravity as a weapon. He said energy retention wasn't something computers calculated, it was something pilots learned to feel. Cole scoffed and accused him of cheating. Holloway looked at him with eyes so tired and steady that the room fell silent. He asked Cole if he had ever read about the pilots who flew Thunderbolts in the war, men who fought for minutes at a time with engines bleeding oil, wings shredded by flak, sometimes losing electrical power entirely, yet flying as if their will alone kept the aircraft airborne. Holloway said the Thunderbolt wasn't a machine you flew with precision. It was one you flew with intent. The briefing dissolved into an argument between officers. The European observers whispered among themselves. The Americans grew defensive. The entire demonstration had been designed to showcase modern superiority, but instead it had ripped open a truth they didn't want to face. Technology didn't erase history. It only hid it. Later, that afternoon, the second phase of the demonstration was planned, this time with different rules. The F-15s would attempt a coordinated intercept at higher altitude, where the Eagles' raw performance would give them every advantage. The command staff expected Holloway to decline. He didn't. He climbed back into the P-47 with the same calm resolve he had shown earlier. Cole strapped into his F-15 with the fury burning behind his eyes. His pride had been wounded in front of every senior officer in the region, and the idea of losing a second engagement was intolerable. This time he promised himself he would not underestimate Holloway, not because he respected him, but because humiliation was something he refused to feel twice. As the aircraft took off again, tension settled over the range like a storm about to break. This time the P-47 didn't stay low. Holloway climbed to meet the Eagles at altitude, pushing the Thunderbolt to limits that would have made wartime pilots nervous. But the massive radial engine roared with confidence, climbing steadily into the thinning air. Cole and his wingmen soared into position above and behind Holloway, setting up for a classic high-speed intercept. Holloway rolled the P-47 smoothly, giving the impression that the aircraft was not an antique, but a beast awakening from long sleep. Cole locked onto him visually. He felt certain the higher engagement would expose the Thunderbolt's weaknesses. As the F-15s closed in, Holloway abruptly pulled the P-47 into a steep spiral dive. Cole followed instantly, rolling into a perfect intercept angle. His wingman warned him to control his descent speed. Cole ignored him. The Thunderbolt dove fast and deep, but the F-15 dove faster. Cole felt the rush of acceleration, the G-forces digging into his chest. He anticipated that Holloway would pull up at the bottom of the dive and try to regain altitude. Instead, Holloway did something unthinkable. He kept diving straight toward a thermal pocket that had been marked unstable during pre-flight briefings. Cole cursed as turbulence slammed into his jet. The P-47 plowed through the rough air as if it were slicing through smoke. The F-15 bucked violently. Cole nearly lost control. He shouted an expletive and pulled out of the dive seconds later. His wingman pulled out even earlier, fearing structural strain. The Thunderbolt roared out of the turbulence, gaining speed and energy. Cole had never seen a piston aircraft accumulate. Holloway pulled hard into a climbing loop. Cole tried to follow. He lost energy instantly. The Thunderbolt, with its monstrous engine torque and weight, carried more momentum than the sleek F-15 expected. Cole suddenly found himself below Holloway, inverted, out of position and exposed. Holloway tightened the loop, dove behind Cole and simulated a guns-on-firing solution for the second time that day. The judges called it kill confirmed. Cole snapped. He cursed violently over the radio. He shouted that Holloway wasn't fighting fair. His wingman told him Holloway was flying the aircraft exactly the way its original pilots had been trained to fly it. Cole shut off his microphone. He refused to acknowledge what was happening. Holloway pulled the Thunderbolt into level flight and eased toward the airfield. The observation crews erupted into stunned disbelief. The planned documentary had turned into a global embarrassment for the F-15 demonstration team. When Holloway landed, the entire airfield watched him taxi across the ramp. He didn't look like a man who had won anything. He looked like a man remembering things no one else understood. Cole landed behind him, slamming his canopy open, ripping off his helmet and refusing to look at anyone. Holloway walked past him without a word, offering him the dignity of silence. Cole couldn't stand it. He ran after Holloway and grabbed his arm. He demanded to know how a 70-year-old Wobbit had beaten him twice. Holloway looked him square in the eyes and spoke softly. "The Thunderbolt was built to survive men better than you." Cole froze. For the first time all day, he had no comeback. Holloway walked away while the F-15 pilot stood rooted to the concrete, his pride shattered in the place where he believed he was invincible. The demonstration had one more phase scheduled for the evening. But by then everyone in the airfield already knew one thing. The P-47 Thunderbolt had rewritten the lesson. This was no relic. No relic could fight like that. This was history reminding the modern world that the sky never belonged to technology. It belonged to those who earned it. As the afternoon sun sank lower over the horizon, the airfield began to feel less like a demonstration site and more like a pressure chamber, tightening around everyone inside it. The conversations had changed in tone. Earlier in the day, technicians laughed and joked about the relic that would be flown for nostalgia. Now they spoke in quiet, clipped exchanges, glancing nervously at the P-47 Thunderbolt as if it were a living creature rather than an old aircraft restored for historical display. Holloway had disrupted the expected hierarchy, and nothing unsettles modern pilots more than having their assumptions dismantled in front of peers, superiors and international observers. The senior officers retreated into a closed room for over an hour, attempting to rewrite the schedule and decide whether the final phase of the demonstration should even take place. But the embarrassment already had gravity. Representatives from multiple countries had witnessed the Thunderbolt outperform the F-15s not once but twice, each time using tactics that analysts insisted were extinct in modern doctrine. Canceling the last phase would signal weakness. Proceeding with it risked another humiliation. The political cost of either choice spiraled in circles around the room. Meanwhile, Cole sat alone in the locker area with his head in his hands, replaying each engagement in his mind in slow, painful detail. He still couldn't comprehend how a machine built before his grandparents were born could outmaneuver an Eagle, a fighter designed with cutting-edge thrust-to-weight ratios, superior avionics, and extreme control authority. His wingman tried to speak with him, but Cole brushed him aside. Pride was a fragile thing, and his had been torn apart twice in front of every ranking official within 100 miles. Holloway walked through the corridor quietly, his boots making barely any sound, yet every room seemed to fall silent as he passed. Not because he was feared or resented, but because no one could reconcile the calm expression on his face with the ferocity he had unleashed in the sky. The final phase of the demonstration was originally designed to showcase how a modern fighter could easily dominate legacy intercept technology. Two F-15s would fly coordinated tactics in a wide engagement zone over the open valley, while the P-47 would attempt to escape. On paper, it was impossible for the Thunderbolt to evade. There was nowhere to hide, no terrain advantage, no altitude tricks, no fog, no forest, nothing but open air and physics. The perfect environment for the F-15s to showcase their dominance. Or at least that was the belief when the schedule was planned. Now no one was certain. Cole demanded to fly the final engagement. More accurately, he refused to allow anyone else to fly it. He said it was his responsibility to restore the Eagle's honor, to prove that what had happened earlier was nothing more than flukes and illusions created by low-altitude tricks. His request was approved reluctantly. Many officers believed Cole was too emotionally unstable after being defeated twice. But the alternative was allowing someone else to face Holloway, and that would publicly admit that Cole had been overpowered by an old aircraft and was no longer trusted. Command approved Holloway as well, though some officers privately wished he would decline so the situation could deflate with minimal public damage. Holloway accepted without hesitation. He wasn't driven by pride, competitiveness, or triumph. Something more deliberate pushed him forward. A belief that this demonstration was no longer about proving superiority, but proving memory. The air was cooling as evening approached, gradually tinting the sky into soft shades of blue and orange. Aircraft crews prepared the Thunderbolt and the Eagles for the final engagement. Every sound, the clang of tools, the hiss of compressors, the snap of electrical connectors echoed across the tarmac like metallic punctuation. The crowd of international observers grew larger, many having heard about the morning engagements. There was a different energy in the air now. Less excitement, more anticipation mixed with disbelief. Holloway climbed into the P-47 with the quiet ritual of someone stepping into an older life. He checked every mechanical gauge the way wartime pilots once did, reading vibration, pressure and torque by feel rather than by digital certainty. Cole climbed into his F-15 like a man arming himself for war. His movements were sharp, almost violent, his breathing audible through the communications line as he ran through startup procedures faster than usual. When both aircraft taxied toward the runway, tension thickened across the airfield. Officers could feel it. Crew members could feel it. Even the spectators sensed that whatever happened next would not be easily dismissed. The engagement began at high altitude in perfectly clear skies. Cole and his wingmen took wide flanking positions, preparing to box the Thunderbolt in from two sides, denying Holloway any escape routes. Holloway ascended steadily, the Thunderbolt's enormous radial engine roaring confidently as it clawed upward. But as soon as Cole moved into range, something changed. Holloway didn't flee, he didn't dive, he didn't turn away. He flew toward them. Directly, Cole cursed. This wasn't how the exercise was supposed to unfold. The Thunderbolt should have acted like prey. Instead, it behaved like a predator. Cole and his wingmen rolled into defensive positions, but Holloway didn't attack with speed, he attacked with angle. The P-47 lunged into a tight climbing turn that forced one F-15 to break formation and reposition. Cole attempted to intercept, but Holloway inverted the Thunderbolt and dove through a gap between both F-15s, forcing Cole to cross his own wingman's path. Command shouted over the radio to maintain separation. Cole snarled back that he had it under control. Even though he didn't, Holloway exploited the chaos with terrifying precision. The Thunderbolt, too heavy to match the F-15 speed, used its momentum as a weapon. Holloway dove into a valley of clean air, pulled into a climbing loop and came up behind Cole's wingman with shocking speed. The judges called the simulated kill instantly. One F-15 down, Cole shouted that it didn't count. But even he didn't believe his own voice. Only seconds later, he found himself alone. Holloway rolled the thunderbolt directly into his path, forcing Cole to choose between maintaining speed and risking a collision or breaking away and sacrificing position. Cole pulled into a steep climb, trying to regain advantage, but the P-47 followed with the stubborn persistence of a boulder rolling uphill. Holloway's maneuver was not elegant. It was primal, and it worked. Cole felt rage building in his chest. He pushed the Eagle's engines to maximum military power, trying to break the engagement, but Holloway anticipated the attempt. He performed a high G-split S maneuver that should have snapped the Thunderbolt S wings by any modern calculation, yet the aircraft held. Cole tried to follow. He almost blacked out. Holloway stabilized behind him. The judges prepared to call the second kill, but Holloway didn't follow through. Instead, he broke away, allowing Cole to recover. Confusion swept through the observers. Why had Holloway pulled out? Why didn't he finish the engagement? Why give Cole another chance? The reason became clear within seconds. Holloway wasn't trying to defeat Cole, he was trying to teach him. Cole realized it too late. He attempted to climb again, desperate to regain control of the engagement. Holloway cut across his path, using the Thunderbolt S sheer mass to force Cole into a defensive posture he had never practiced against a piston aircraft. Cole tried to compensate with speed. Holloway countered with gravity. Cole tried to use altitude. Holloway responded with torque. The Thunderbolt's enormous Pratt and Whitney engine bellowed like an animal that refused to die, and every time Cole believed he had found an advantage, the P-47 twisted that assumption into a trap. At one point, Cole shouted that Holloway was trying to humiliate him, but Holloway knew the truth. Cole wasn't being humiliated. He was being exposed. Exposed to the fundamental truth that combat was never about technology. It was about instinct, timing, nerve, and the willingness to fly through fear rather than around it. The engagement ended when Holloway rolled the Thunderbolt underneath Cole's SF-15 and rose into his blind spot with a simulated burst of gunfire. The judges called it instantly. Third engagement, third simulated kill. Silence fell across the valley, a silence so vast and so heavy that even the engines seemed to hesitate before cooling. Cole landed with the expression of a man who had lost more than a mock engagement. He had lost certainty, he had lost superiority. He had lost the illusion that modern training alone made him untouchable. Meanwhile, Holloway brought the Thunderbolt down gently, its wheels touching the runway as if it were settling into memory rather than landing on concrete. When the engine finally powered down, the airfield seemed to exhale. Officers exchanged glances, unsure how to salvage the demonstration or the reputation of the F-15 team. International observers whispered about rewriting doctrines, about studying the psychological dimensions of legacy tactics, about reevaluating the arrogance of assuming newer meant better. But Holloway didn't stay to hear their debates. He climbed down from the Thunderbolt with quiet dignity and walked away from the aircraft, leaving the crowd to decide for themselves what they had just witnessed. By the time the sun finally slipped behind the mountains, the truth had settled over the airfield like the weight of history itself. The P-47 Thunderbolt had not returned to prove it was superior. It had returned to remind the world that what survives the longest isn't always the most advanced. Sometimes it's the one built to endure. Night settled slowly over the airfield, and with it came a heaviness that felt almost gravitational, as if the entire base were sinking under the weight of what had happened. The world outside the fences remained unaware, but inside, every conversation, every movement and every decision was colored by the shockwave Holloway and the Thunderbolt had unleashed. No one spoke loudly anymore. Even the usual chatter of mechanics had faded into whispers, as if raising one's voice might disturb something fragile in the air. The officers who had been so confident in the morning now looked like men walking out of a storm they never saw coming. Intelligence analysts reviewed footage repeatedly, stopping at moments where the P-47 performed maneuvers considered aerodynamically improbable. They slowed the recordings, adjusted contrast, argued physics and airflow characteristics, and still came to the same impossible conclusion: the aircraft did what it should not have been able to do, and Holloway did it with the ease of a man slicing familiar patterns into the sky. This terrified them more than they admitted. The political observers from allied nations filed reports in coded language, careful not to insult their hosts yet unable to hide the truth. They wrote that modern doctrine had overlooked something essential in its pursuit of technological supremacy, that human instinct had atrophied behind layers of automation, and that the Day's demonstration posed questions no one in the chain of command wanted to answer. Cole, meanwhile, refused to leave the hangar. He stood near his F-15, arms crossed tightly, jaw clenched so hard it looked painful. A couple of junior pilots approached him, trying to offer comfort, but he dismissed them with a single look. Pride wasn't his problem anymore. Identity was. He had built his entire career around the belief that modern fighters were the pinnacle of aerial combat, that the Eagle was untouchable, that technology put him on a throne. Holloway had shattered that illusion in less than a day. Even worse, Holloway hadn't gloated. He hadn't celebrated. He hadn't even criticized. He simply flew, and that simplicity made the defeat burn deeper. Command eventually called Cole to a private room for debriefing, but he refused to enter until they ordered him formally. When he finally sat down, he stared straight ahead, eyes unfocused, as though watching the engagements replay behind his eyelids. The senior commander tried to lead with neutrality, but frustration tightened his voice. He asked Cole for a detailed breakdown of each maneuver, for an explanation of how Holloway had positioned the Thunderbolt in impossible angles, for insight into what had gone wrong. Cole said nothing. The commander pressed harder. Cole swallowed and finally said the words he had been dreading. "I don't know." The room fell silent. Officers exchanged stunned glances. Cole continued speaking, his voice losing its edge for the first time all day. He said Holloway flew with a kind of instinct he had never seen. He said the P-47 had momentum characteristics he had underestimated. He said modern training ignored low-altitude energy tactics. He said the Eagle's speed was useless if it couldn't angle properly. The commander grew irritated, accusing Cole of making excuses. Cole snapped back that he wasn't making excuses, he was telling them the truth. Technology had made them complacent, computers had become crutches. They had forgotten how to fly with their hands and their nerve. They relied on flight envelopes, not flight instincts. The commander dismissed him abruptly. But the truth Cole spoke remained in the room long after he left. Holloway, for his part, had slipped away from the crowd. He walked the quiet southern edge of the airfield where the lights hit the runway in long golden streaks. He felt the weight of the day too, but differently. He had not flown to humiliate anyone. He had flown to honor the men whose legacy had been forgotten. He knew the P-47 better than any living pilot, not because he worshipped the aircraft, but because he understood the world that created it. He understood fear, he understood desperation, he understood survival, and those things didn't disappear when technology improved. They simply faded into the background until someone brought them back to the surface. A few officers approached him cautiously, asking if he had modified the Thunderbolt in any way, if he had practiced maneuvers that violated structural safety limits, if he had exploited vulnerabilities in the F-15 pilot's training. Holloway answered methodically, the aircraft was stock. The maneuvers were within the Thunderbolt's historical envelope, and as for exploiting vulnerabilities, he simply flew the way older pilots had been taught to fight. Eventually, the officers retreated, leaving Holloway alone with a small hum of distant generators. The final phase of the demonstration had technically ended, but the ripple effects were only beginning. International representatives held urgent discussions behind closed doors. The Americans were defensive, scrambling to reframe the day's results before the footage could be leaked or interpreted as a sign of weakness. The European officers were fascinated and alarmed in equal measure. They whispered about rewriting training syllabi and reevaluating assumptions about legacy aircraft. But none of them had the courage to bring their questions to Holloway directly. Only one person did. Cole. He found Holloway standing near the P-47, the aircraft's metal skin reflecting the amber runway lights. Cole approached him with slow, heavy steps, each one feeling like it cost him a piece of pride. Holloway didn't turn around. He sensed Cole's presence and waited. Cole stood beside the Thunderbolt's wing, breathing hard as if he had run a long distance. He opened his mouth twice before sound finally came out. "How did you do it?" Holloway didn't answer immediately. He rested his hand on the cold metal of the Thunderbolt, then looked at Cole. He didn't speak with arrogance or condescension. He spoke like a man offering truth to someone who needed it. "You fly machines like this with everything you are, not with what the cockpit gives you." Cole exhaled shakily. Holloway continued. "You fly with what you feel in your bones. You fight with instinct. You move with purpose. And you survive because you accept that the sky owes you nothing." Cole stared at the aircraft, tracing its massive frame with his eyes. He had spent years believing that modern jets were the apex of evolution, that older machines were simply stepping stones toward progress. Now he saw the P-47 differently. Not as a relic, as a survivor. Holloway stepped closer to him. "Technology and strength, discipline isn't enough. Speed doesn't make you untouchable. What matters is resolve." And the Thunderbolt was built by men who had nothing else. Cole didn't respond. He couldn't. Holloway started to walk away, but Cole's voice stopped him. "Would you fly it again tomorrow?" Holloway turned. Without hesitation, he said yes. Cole's eyes burned. "Then I want another chance. Not for show. Not for the crowd. For myself." Holloway studied him quietly. The anger in Cole's expression had changed. It was no longer prideful rage. It was something closer to humility. The first crack forming in the shell he had built around his identity. Holloway nodded once and walked off into the dim light, leaving Cole alone with the Thunderbolt. As the night deepened, the airfield slowly settled into uneasy rest. But beneath the quiet, everyone knew the day had not ended anything. It had only begun something much larger. Something that would redefine more than one man's pride. Something that would challenge the way modern pilots saw themselves, their aircraft, and the very meaning of mastery in the sky. Because tomorrow, the world would want answers, and only the sky had them. The following morning rose with the weight of expectation pressing down on the base like a low, unmoving cloud. No one slept well. Some barely slept at all. There were too many questions without answers. Too many implications that reached far beyond the airfield, too many eyes watching from far away. By dawn, the demonstration had already leaked. It was impossible to hide something that dramatic, not with so many witnesses and so many international observers who were sworn to maintain discretion but were privately stunned by what they had seen. A handful of grainy cell phone videos had surfaced online overnight, taken by maintenance staff and civilian contractors who were instructed not to film but did anyway. The videos didn't show the full engagements, only fragments, silhouettes of the P-47 cutting angles the F-15 couldn't follow, flashes of metal against the sky, the roar of engines mismatched in time. But the fragments were enough. Aviation analysts on social media debated whether the footage was doctored, claiming the P-47 must have been modified. Others argued the footage was real, and that modern pilots had simply grown complacent. A heated debate exploded across forums, drawing the attention of journalists and eventually military intelligence. By sunrise, the Pentagon had sent a classified request demanding a full report and immediate access to the unedited footage. The European coalition sent another request asking for the same, though with far less courtesy. At the airfield, the atmosphere tightened even further. Holloway walked into the operations center quietly, not to intervene, but simply because the staff asked him to be present while they reviewed the recordings again. His presence unsettled some of the officers, but comforted others. Cole arrived soon after, looking like a man who had aged 10 years overnight. His uniform was crisp, but his eyes were hollow. He moved with the rigid posture of someone who had forced himself awake with nothing but stubbornness. He avoided Holloway's eyes at first, but eventually approached him. Holloway didn't speak. Cole didn't speak. They simply stood near one another, the silence between them heavy but no longer hostile. The senior commander entered the room, his jaw tight. He ordered everyone to take their seats and began the formal inquiry. The footage of the first engagement played on the large monitor. No commentary, just raw images. The Thunderbolt racing low over the treetops, the F-15 struggling to maintain position, Holloway flipping the momentum of the engagement in seconds. Cole flinched at the moment where the Thunderbolt rolled behind him. Then the second engagement played, showing Holloway diving into turbulence the F-15s couldn't handle. Then the third engagement, the one that humiliated Cole the most. Officers paused the footage repeatedly, pointing out moments where the Thunderbolt executed maneuvers that modern doctrine no longer taught. At one point, the commander asked Holloway how he knew the P-47 could handle the structural load he placed on it. Holloway answered calmly, because the men who built this knew it needed to come home no matter what happened to it. The commander pressed him again, asking if he had studied classified Soviet-era MiG-15 doctrine or if he had used modified components. Holloway shook his head. He spoke softly, "I studied the pilots, not the machines. The machines only make sense once you understand the men who flew them." The room fell silent. Cole looked down, inhaling slowly. A European officer leaned forward and asked Holloway why he had broken off the second simulated kill instead of finishing the engagement cleanly. Holloway hesitated for the first time that day. Finally, he said he knew Cole needed to see the engagement differently, not as a defeat, but as a mirror. Cole closed his eyes. Officers exchanged looks. The commander asked Holloway whether he believed the Thunderbolt could consistently defeat a modern fighter. Holloway replied that the P-47 could not outrun, or outclimb, or outmaneuver an F-15 in a conventional engagement. But in close quarters, under the right circumstances, using the right instincts, it could absolutely force a modern pilot into mistakes they did not train for. That answer created a ripple of discomfort across the room. It suggested something no one wanted to acknowledge. Modern doctrine had blind spots, and the Thunderbolt had exploited every one of them. After the briefing, Holloway stepped outside to breathe in the cold morning air. The runway glistened under faint dew. The Thunderbolt sat near the hangar, its silver skin catching the light like an old scar. Cole followed him outside. This time Holloway didn't walk away. Cole stood beside him for a long moment before speaking. I watched the footage again. Holloway nodded but didn't respond. Cole took a breath that trembled slightly. You flew like you weren't afraid. Holloway looked at him. I was afraid. I'm always afraid. Fear keeps a pilot alive. Cole stared at the ground. He had never admitted fear openly, not once in his career. He looked back at Holloway with something closer to respect than resentment. Can you teach me? Holloway studied him quietly. It was the question he had been waiting to hear. Yes, but not in the air. In your mind, Cole frowned. Holloway explained. The Thunderbolt is not faster. It is not smarter. It is not better. What it is unforgiving. It demands commitment to every action. It rewards resolve. It punishes hesitation. If you want to learn from it, you have to unlearn everything that convinces you that technology will save you. Cole nodded slowly. It wasn't humiliation in his eyes now. It was hunger. He wanted to understand. He wanted redemption. And Holloway knew the only way to rebuild Cole was to break the parts of him that had relied heavily on modern comfort. Before Holloway could continue, an urgent radio call summoned both pilots back to the command center. When they arrived, the atmosphere was different, tense, urgent, conflicted. The commander informed them that a new development had emerged overnight. An unsanctioned civilian aircraft, a private twin-engine plane, had violated restricted airspace 30 miles west of the base. It was not malicious, but it was dangerous. The plane's transponder was malfunctioning, and its pilot appeared disoriented. The aircraft was drifting toward a flight corridor that would soon contain multiple inbound transports. Interception was required. Normally, two F-15s would be scrambled with no hesitation. But after yesterday, command hesitated. Not because the F-15s lacked capability, but because the situation required delicate handling. The civilian pilot might panic if approached aggressively. The aircraft was old, unstable, and flying erratically. If the Eagles approached too fast or too close, they could frighten the pilot into making a fatal mistake. Holloway glanced at the Thunderbolt. The commander noticed. He shut the idea down instantly. Absolutely not. The P-47 is not going into the air for an act of interception. Cole's head snapped toward Holloway. He knew what Holloway was thinking. The Thunderbolt's slower speed, massive stability, and non-threatening profile made it ideal for calming a frightened pilot. The F-15s, sleek and imposing, could escalate the situation unintentionally? Holloway said nothing. Cole did. Sir, with respect, the P-47 could approach quietly, safely, and create a visual contact that won't terrify the civilian pilot. The commander ordered him to be quiet. Cole persisted. That aircraft out there is flying blind. If we approach it with supersonic fighters, the pilot will freeze or panic. We need something that won't look like a threat. Something steady. Something loud enough to be heard, but slow enough to be predictable. Officers murmured. The argument was not irrational. Holloway offered a single sentence that shifted the room. The Thunderbolt was built to escort bombers 3,000 miles while keeping them calm under fire. If it can do that, it can do this. Silence swallowed the room. Finally, the commander exhaled sharply and turned to Holloway. One flight, one pass, visual contact only. If anything goes wrong, the Eagles take over. Holloway nodded. Cole's eyes widened slightly. Holloway looked at him. You're coming. Cole blinked, stunned. Me. Holloway nodded. You need to see what the sky looks like when no one is trying to win. Cole swallowed hard and nodded. Minutes later, the air crew prepared the Thunderbolt. The massive radial engine growled to life once more, shaking the ground beneath it. Holloway climbed into the cockpit, and this time Cole sat behind him in the jump seat installed for documentation purposes. The engines were surrounded them, and Cole felt the vibration pulse through his chest like a heartbeat from another era. Holloway checked the instruments in silence, then taxied toward the runway. As the wheels lifted and the Thunderbolt rose into the morning sky, Cole felt a strange sensation creep through him, a mixture of fear, awe, and something deeper. Something that felt almost like humility finally settling where arrogance had once lived. Holloway leveled the aircraft and aimed toward the radar coordinates. Cole stared out the canopy at the wings trembling slightly against the wind. And for the first time, he saw the Thunderbolt not as a relic, but as a guardian, and the sky no longer looked like a battlefield. It looked like a test, and he understood that this flight would change everything. The Thunderbolt moved through the morning sky with a kind of steady authority that surprised Cole more with each passing second. The aircraft didn't slice through the air like an eagle. It didn't glide like a modern fighter conditioned by computers and polished aerodynamics. Instead, it pushed its way forward, shoving the wind aside with raw mass and unyielding momentum, vibrating through Cole's bones in a way that felt primitive and strangely comforting. The radial engine didn't purr. It roared, deep and resonant, like a living creature that had never learned the meaning of surrender. Cole sat behind Holloway, absorbing every sensation. Each vibration, each subtle movement of the control stick, each micro-adjustment Holloway made with his hands and feet. It was flying at its most elemental, stripped of layers of digital mediation. And Cole realized something that made his stomach tighten. He had forgotten what this felt like. Somewhere in the years of training simulators, advanced avionics, and cockpit automation, he had lost the raw tactile reality of flight. Holloway remained silent for most of the climb toward the civilian aircraft's last known location. He focused on reading the air the way older pilots once did, watching the clouds, feeling pressure shifts, listening to subtle changes in engine rhythm. Cole tried to do the same, but the sensations were overwhelming. He wasn't ready. Not yet. Radar updates came from the ground every few minutes. The civilian aircraft was drifting erratically, altitude fluctuating, heading unstable. Once it even appeared to stall, only to nose down and regain control moments later. The pilot was clearly disoriented. Holloway pushed the Thunderbolt slightly faster, the radial engine growling louder, the cockpit trembling with effort. Cole gripped the seat behind him, not out of fear, but out of astonishment that this 70-year-old aircraft still had so much strength left in it. After another few minutes, the ground controller relayed an update. Visual contact likely within 3 miles. Holloway leveled the aircraft, scanning ahead. Cole leaned forward, squinting into the brightening sky. Then he saw it. A small twin-engine aircraft drifting slightly right of course, wings wobbling with inconsistent correction. It looked fragile compared to the Thunderbolt, as if a gust of wind might snap it in half. Holloway eased the P-47 closer, keeping a careful, respectful distance. The point was to be seen, but not to overwhelm. As they approached, the civilian plane jerked sideways, suddenly as the pilot overcorrected. Holloway steadied the Thunderbolt, maintaining a predictable path. Cole watched the pilot through the tiny cockpit window. Even from a distance, he could tell the man was in distress. Holloway angled the Thunderbolt so that the civilian could clearly see them. The large round engine and iconic silhouette were unmistakable. The radial's deep, steady rumble filled the air, and Cole imagined how it must sound to the pilot in the other aircraft. Loud, but not threatening. Holloway dipped the P-47's wings gently, a universal aviation signal meaning "follow me." At first the civilian plane didn't respond. Then, after a few wavering seconds, its wings tilted in a clumsy acknowledgement. Holloway let out a slow breath. Cole felt relief too. They stayed beside the aircraft, guiding it gradually away from the restricted corridor and toward a safe vector that the ground controller relayed. For several minutes, the 3 aircraft moved as a trio through the open sky, the Thunderbolt acting as a shepherd, the civilian aircraft trembling but compliant. Then, without warning, the twin-engine plane lurched violently. One engine coughed, sputtered, and died. Smoke trailed from the right side. The aircraft dipped sharply, losing altitude fast. Cole cursed. Holloway tightened his grip on the controls. The civilian pilot was panicking now, the nose wobbling dangerously. Holloway angled the Thunderbolt downward, matching the descent, refusing to let the aircraft spiral out of sight. Cole leaned forward, eyes wide. He could see the civilian pilot's hands moving frantically inside the cockpit. Holloway steadied the Thunderbolt's descent to show the pilot the correct attitude, the correct posture to avoid stalling, to prepare for an emergency landing if needed. The other aircraft copied the movement imperfectly, but enough to stabilize. Holloway spoke for the first time since takeoff. "He's scared. Keep your eyes open. Learn from this." Cole swallowed hard. He didn't know if he was ready to learn from anything happening at this altitude with this much on the line. The 2 aircraft descended together until the ground controller gave new instructions. There was a long, flat stretch of open terrain ahead, barely suitable for an emergency landing, but better than the uneven terrain behind them. Holloway dipped his wings again. The civilian pilot dipped his. The descent continued. The damaged aircraft trembled violently, one engine still dead, the pilot fighting for control. Holloway maintained formation so close that Cole could read the tail number of the other plane. The Thunderbolt's presence steadied the air around them, its heavy frame carving a predictable pathway through turbulence. The ground rushed upward. Cole tensed as the civilian aircraft approached a landing surface that was far from ideal. The plane touched down hard, bouncing once, twice, before skidding across the flat earth in a plume of dust. It finally came to a grinding halt. Holloway pulled up, circled once, then brought the Thunderbolt down in a controlled landing a safe distance away. When the engine finally quieted, Cole exhaled shakily, realizing only now that he had been holding his breath for a full minute. Holloway climbed out of the cockpit and Cole followed him, boots crunching in the dry earth. They approached the downed aircraft. The civilian pilot stumbled out, shaken but unharmed. Holloway spoke to him calmly, guiding him away from the wreckage while Cole radioed the base. Emergency crews were dispatched immediately. After a few minutes, the civilian pilot, still trembling, looked at the Thunderbolt and whispered something Cole would never forget. "I thought you were an angel." Holloway offered a faint smile, but said nothing. Cole stared at the P-47. He didn't see an angel. He saw a machine built for war, performing an act of peace with more grace than he had ever witnessed from a modern jet. When the rescue helicopter finally arrived and the civilian was airlifted out, Holloway and Cole stood alone beside the Thunderbolt. The wind moved gently over the metal skin, carrying dust across the wings. Cole spoke first. "You knew exactly what to do?" Holloway shook his head. "No, I knew what not to do." Cole frowned. Holloway pointed to the sky. "Modern fighters force decisions. This one offers them." Cole looked again at the aircraft, at its shape, at its scars, at its presence, then at Holloway. "Teach me everything." Holloway nodded once, slowly. The kind of nod a mentor gives when a student finally becomes worthy of being shaped. As they waited for transport back to the base, Cole sat beside the massive engine cowling, resting his hand on the metal. It was warm, alive, a reminder that some machines carried more than engineering, they carried lessons. It wasn't to prove the P-47 superior. It was to remind the world how much they had forgotten. And Cole realized he had been forgetting too. When the helicopter returned to pick them up, he looked back at the Thunderbolt one last time. Not as a relic, not as a rival, as a teacher. And he knew the sky would never look the same again. The helicopter ride back to the airfield felt longer than the entire mission. Cole sat in silence, staring at the drifting clouds while the wind thumped against the fuselage. He wasn't replaying the interception, or the landing, or even the moment the civilian pilot stepped out of the damaged aircraft whispering that he thought the Thunderbolt was an angel. What replayed in Cole's mind was something far quieter and far heavier. The realization that for the first time in years, he had flown without relying on software to shape his decisions. The truth that fear and humility were not weaknesses but guideposts. Holloway sat opposite him, hands clasped loosely, expression calm but thoughtful. He had seen this transformation before. Not in Cole, but in younger pilots decades earlier who had come to him wanting to understand something deeper about flying. Something not found in textbooks or simulators. Something older. Something truer. When the helicopter landed and Cole stepped onto the tarmac, the airfield looked different, but in the silent way people looked at him and at Holloway. At the Thunderbolt resting alone at the far end of the runway, at the empty valley where modern jets had been humbled by a 70-year-old war horse. Word had spread like wildfire. Reporters were being blocked at the gates. Diplomats were demanding answers. Social media buzzed with clips of the P-47 screaming low across the treetops. Aviation historians were giving late-night interviews claiming they weren't surprised at all, and military analysts were arguing on live television over what the engagements meant for modern doctrine. But inside the base, the tension had taken on a different shape. It wasn't humiliation anymore, it was reckoning. Holloway and Cole were escorted to the operations center, where high-ranking officers from multiple commands waited with faces carved in stone. The senior commander began the briefing with unusual gravity. He explained that higher headquarters had requested a full classified investigation into the events of the last 24 hours. He said the footage would be reviewed at the highest levels. Then he did something surprising. He asked Holloway to describe the interception again, not from a technical perspective, but from a human one. Holloway had never been asked that question before. Not in those words. He took a breath and spoke slowly. He said the civilian pilot didn't need precision. He needed presence. He said the Thunderbolt brought that presence in a way a modern fighter couldn't. The officers listened, not interrupting. Then the commander turned to Cole. His tone changed. Harder. Sharper. What did you learn from this demonstration? Cole's throat tightened. He had been preparing himself for this moment, without realizing it. And now that it was here, he felt the truth forming inside him, with clarity he could not ignore. He said he had learned that speed meant nothing if used without discipline. That radar meant nothing if used without awareness. That training meant nothing if it wasn't challenged. He said the P-47 had shown him something he didn't know he needed to see. The officers exchanged glances, some skeptical, some contemplative. One asked if he truly believed a piston aircraft could compete with an F-15. Cole shook his head. No, not compete, but challenge. And it did. That answer carried weight because it was honest. It also carried danger because it challenged the foundation on which modern doctrine stood. Officers argued over whether the Thunderbolt engagement was an anomaly or a warning. Analysts proposed rewriting sections of air combat curriculum. Some pushed for repeating the demonstration under more controlled conditions. Others argued they should bury the footage entirely. Holloway left the room quietly, but Cole stayed behind, listening, absorbing every argument and counter-argument. But he did feel awake. Outside, the sun was beginning to set, washing the entire airfield in a soft orange glow. A supply truck rumbled by. Ground crews moved silently among the hangars. The Thunderbolt sat alone, its propeller glinting faintly in the fading light as if acknowledging everything it had done. Holloway approached it slowly. Cole followed a few moments later. Neither spoke at first. They simply stood beside the aircraft that had changed the day, the base, and possibly the trajectory of modern training. Holloway traced a hand along the metal skin thoughtfully. Cole broke the silence. They're not going to let this go. You know. Holloway nodded. They shouldn't. Cole looked at him. You think they'll fly it again? Holloway shook his head. Not like today. Not like this. It wasn't meant to be a spectacle. Cole felt a pang in his chest. He had expected that answer. Maybe even feared it. He looked at the Thunderbolt once more, feeling the same strange mixture of awe and humility that had struck him in the cockpit. So what now? Holloway took a long breath. Now you learn. Cole frowned. Learn what? Everything the sky has been trying to tell you. Cole didn't fully understand the meaning yet, but he felt it. Felt the truth of it woven into the fabric of everything the last 24 hours had shown him. Later that night, a formal message came in from higher command. The demonstration would be suspended, the footage locked down. A multi-branch review board created. The P-47 would be grounded indefinitely pending further evaluation. And Holloway was to provide an in-depth written report for immediate transfer to classified archives. Cole read the message beside him. He felt something tighten in his chest, but he wasn't surprised. But something else had shifted inside Cole, something that made the silence between them feel like a question waiting to be answered. Holloway noticed. You're not satisfied. Are you? Cole shook his head. No, not anymore. Holloway smiled faintly. Good. The next morning Cole woke before dawn. He walked to the hangar alone, the early chill biting into his skin. The Thunderbolt sat inside, the overhead lights casting long shadows across its wings. Holloway was already there, waiting for him with a small binder of handwritten notes and diagrams. Cole blinked in surprise. What's this? Lessons. The ones you asked for. Cole took the binder with both hands. It wasn't a manual. It wasn't technical. It wasn't doctrine. It was something deeper, something Holloway had collected over decades. Notes about energy, instincts, angles, fear, memory, humility, resolve. Cole felt a weight in his chest he couldn't describe. Holloway met his eyes. You want to be better. This is where it starts. Cole nodded slowly, understanding more than words could capture. Over the next hours Holloway walked him through everything in the binder. Not just flying techniques, not just maneuvers, but mindset. What older pilots understood because they had to? what modern pilots had forgotten because they didn't. Resolve, sacrifice, awareness, the understanding that the sky was not an enemy or an ally, but a presence that demanded respect. By midday, Cole felt something he hadn't felt in years. Hunger, not the hunger to win. The hunger to grow. That afternoon, the senior commander called both pilots to the operations room again. This time his expression was different. Resolved. He informed them that the review board would begin in 72 hours. That all footage was now classified. That until further notice the demonstration would be considered an anomaly pending technical explanation. Holloway expected this. Cole expected it too? But then the commander said one more thing, something neither of them anticipated. Before this is buried forever, headquarters wants one final internal recording. No public observers. No diplomats. No cameras except the onboard ones. One last flight. Holloway and Cole stared at him. The commander continued. They want the P-47 and the F-15 in the air together one more time. For documentation, for analysis, for truth. Cole felt his pulse quicken. Holloway nodded slowly. When, tonight, there was no ceremony. No spectators. No demonstrations. No expectations of spectacle. Just two pilots and two machines rising into the night sky to capture what could not be explained on paper. The F-15 rolled out first, engines humming like sharpened blades. They took off together, silhouettes climbing into the darkening horizon. Side by side, they flew above the valley, the moonlight reflecting on their wings, the roar of two generations blending into a single echo across the mountains. Cole spoke first. "Thank you." Holloway said nothing for a moment. "Remember what this feels like. Because no matter what they write about this day, the sky keeps its own record." They flew for another hour before returning to the airfield, each carrying a truth no inquiry could erase. When they landed, ground crews approached quietly. Something unspoken had happened in the sky, something that needed no explanation. Cole climbed out of the F-15 and looked at the Thunderbolt, its propeller slowing to a stop, its engine ticking softly as it cooled. Holloway stood beside it, one hand resting on the metal like a farewell. Cole approached him. He understood now that flying was not just technique or technology, it was character. And the Thunderbolt had more of that than any jet he had ever known. Holloway turned to him. "Ready," Cole nodded. More than ever, Holloway extended his hand. Cole took it. The legacy of the P-47 Thunderbolt didn't live in steel or rivets or outdated design. And Cole realized that this day wasn't the end of anything, it was the beginning. Because some machines survive history, others shape it. And the Thunderbolt had just done both. The sky above the base darkened fully, stars emerging one by one. The reports would be written, the footage locked away. The politicians would argue and the analysts would debate. But the truth of what happened would remain where it always had been. The P-47 Thunderbolt never died, and now its memory never would.